Welcome to our second Fall Women's Leadership Forum titled Understanding Sexism in Utah. I'm Dr. Susan Madsen, Founding Director of Utah Women in Leadership Project, and I'm also the Karen Hayde Huntsman Endowed Professor of Leadership and the John M. Huntsman School of Business at Utah State University, and I'm the host and will be the panel moderator today. And this event furthers the mission of the Utah Women in Leadership Project, which is to strengthen the impact of Utah girls and women. And we serve Utah and its residents by first producing relevant, trustworthy, and applicable research, second, creating and gathering valuable resources, and third, convening trainings and events like this that inform, inspire, and ignite growth and change for all Utahns. And I'd like to thank our sponsors, the Utah Education Network, John M. Huntsman School of Business, and USU Extension. And today's panel, as was mentioned, will focus on sexism in Utah. Before I jump into questions, I want to introduce three of my friends who are joining me today and will serve as panelists. And we should have a good discussion. We've all chatted about these issues before. Let me first introduce Robbyn Scribner. She is a women's labor force expert, consultant, and career coach. She is a co-founder and director of outreach for Tech Moms, a workforce reentry program that helps women transition into the tech industry. Robbyn is a prolific researcher and writer on women's issues. She's published more than 50 reports, articles, or snapshots on a variety of topics, including labor force participation, the gender pay gap, male allies, workplace flexibility, and women's careers. She holds a master's and bachelor's degrees from Brigham Young University, and she's a Gallup certified strength coach. Robbyn, awesome to have you here. Thank you. Deneiva Knight is a dedicated community champion with extensive experience and a strong passion for strategic storytelling, as well as making a positive impact on society and in communities. And she's the External Affairs Director at Comcast and is also an entrepreneur. She holds the position of CEO at Leuven Ventures, where she collaborates with her co-founder as they offer professional women a haven from corporate pressures through carefully crafted and cultivated outdoor experiences. Welcome, Deneiva. And then Heather Sundahl. She is an associate marriage and family therapist living in Provo, Utah. And she's also a writer and editor. I've worked with Heather for years, who works specifically with Native American Curriculum Initiative, the Mormon Women for Ethical Government, and has volunteered with Exponent 2 since 1996. I don't know how you can do that, Heather, because you're only 30. So she is a co-editor with Katie Rich of the book 50 Years of Exponent 2, which is to be published soon by Signature Books next year. And Heather has worked as a writer, editor, and researcher on the topics around sexism for the Utah Women in Leadership Project for many years. So I am excited to have this conversation with you and just let people know that we'll bring in questions. So if you put those over in the chat or in the Q&A, we'll work in questions throughout as they come in. My three esteemed panelists will be checking that, and we'll bring some questions in at the end. But I wanted to start by asking you, and Robbyn, I'm going to start with you. How do you define or describe sexism?
That's a great question. Nice and tricky, right? You're starting us off with a good one. So in my opinion, sexism is anything that treats people differently because of their gender, right? But more importantly, it treats people in a disadvantageous way. It hurts them, it harms them because of their gender. So pretty simple definition from me.
Great. Deneiva, do you want to add anything to that definition?
Yeah, I think very similar for me, from my perspective. It's really often like navigating a maze of unfair and unbiased expectations solely based on gender. And so that's like carrying the weight of stereotypes and double standards that often limit women from having opportunities or gaining professional development, and also limiting our ability to like connect and lead and achieve success.
Thank you, Heather.
So while sexism, of course, as Robbyn said, can, it's anything that where you're sort of being targeted because of your sex, I think it's important that we bring up that it really impacts women and gender minorities. And some of the people who do it don't even realize it. They're totally oblivious to it. But those of us who've experienced it, it can be so omnipresent.
Yeah, and I have to say that in the literature or in the data that we collected, we'll talk about this in just a minute, 1,750 sexist comments. But many of the women said that it was everyday sexism for them. And sometimes it was subtle, but it was every day. So I think that's interesting to think about. And it appears in different ways. So Robbyn, I want to go back to you, and let's really start by discussing the study that we did on sexist comments and responses. And you really took the lead for this in 2020 and 2021. And then we ended up co-publishing, and Heather joined us doing some analysis and so forth. But we ended up with 5 reports. So tell us a little bit about why you were interested in doing a study like this, and then how we collected the data.
Well, Susan, you'd been talking for years about how you had this study in mind that you really wanted to do about the types of comments that women heard, mostly because thousands of women over the years had come to you to share their stories, right? When someone says something terrible to us, we need to share that. We need someone else to witness and hear the things that we've heard and experienced. And when you recommended this idea for this research study, I was super interested and really excited to get on board. One of the things that's important for everybody to know, what we're talking about today, these aren't just like random comments we've heard while having lunch with our girlfriends and things like that, although we all have heard hundreds of those as well. But this is from a detailed research study where we gathered the data, as you mentioned, in the summer of 2020. So we were all home with the pandemic. We had a little extra time on our hands to think about all the injustices brought upon us over the years, right? We had really time to stew in our juices with that. And so more than 1,000 women filled out the survey. You sent it out through the Utah Women in Newsletter. You know what I mean? The Utah Women in Leadership Project newsletter, and through a lot of other sources. So we had comments coming in from women all over the state. More than 1,000 women filled out the survey initially. 839 completed the survey. And because each woman was allowed to share up to 4 comments, we ended up with 1,750 individual comments. Now, that may not sound like a lot, but when you're reading them individually and like analyzing them and coding them and putting them into categories, this was a huge study. And really, as you can tell from the 5 briefs that we wrote related to this study, so much rich data. If everybody here on this call today has not had a chance to check out these briefs, after you listen to this webinar today, you are absolutely going to want to go and read all of these briefs. There is so much interesting material here. It shows that we as a state have a lot to learn, and we can grow together and get better together.
And I'll tell you, some of the analysis I did and reading the reports, there were some days that I would have tears. I have to tell you. Heather, you're saying you did. I mean, when you hear, and Deneiva, I know you've heard experiences from people as well. I mean, it just breaks your heart, some of these. And we left some of the worst things out of our research. I mean, we just felt like we couldn't publish some of those. So it was sad in so many ways, but very interesting, and I think super helpful to analyze and divide down. Now, before we get into specifics, Heather, now you jumped in. We had so many comments and it was taking us a long time. So we asked you to jump in and help to analyze some of the qualitative data. Tell us about your experiences in being part of reading through hundreds and even thousands of these comments.
I was not prepared for it. You think, oh yeah, I know what sexist comments look like, but it was so overwhelming. I found I could only do it for a certain amount of time, then I'd have to go for a walk. I'd have to go get a glass of water, kind of, like do a little exorcism of like the bad vibes. And it was, I don't know which ones made me angrier, the ones that were just these really blatant, obvious, clearly misogynistic, no good intention at all, or the ones that were like this chunk of glass covered in a nice little package, like covered in chocolate, like, like the ones that are like, oh, Susan, why don't you take notes for this meeting? Because you've just got lovely handwriting. If someone said you take notes because you're the girl, it would be so easy to call that out. It would be so easy to just like shut something like that down. But when somebody like weaves this sort of benevolent, candy coating on it, it can put women in this really bizarre position where they're like, am I being insulted? What is going on?
Yeah. Oh, thank you for sharing. And one of the things Robbyn and I, when we put together these final reports, and Robbyn, am I right in that about, was it 20% or 25% of the comments were women to women?
Not quite that much.
Not quite that much.
But we had 250 comments out of the 1750 that were women's comments. So we had a lot of internalized sexism, women being sexist against each other, but also even against themselves, women seeing themselves with a sexist perspective.
Yeah, we'll get into that in a little bit. We were commenting before we started on how this time is going to go very quick today. So hopefully you can all stay and join us for the whole thing, because we'll get into some specifics. Now, Deneiva, thank you so much again for joining. You weren't on the research team. You probably would have enjoyed it or been irritated by being on it, but you have read the reports. Before we dive in, any initial insights that you wanted to share before we get to the specifics?
Yeah, there was just so much data there and so much commentary. You all collected so much information. I think the biggest things that stood out for me was that in Utah, sexism impacts women of like various ages, various industries, different places in their careers. So like no women are safe, no women are not experiencing these types of things, whether in work or in the community. And then oftentimes what I found what was interesting is a lot of women are experiencing this before they start their career. So there is commentary in there about college and how that impacted them on choosing their career, being able to move forward with their careers, which I thought was alarming. I love how Heather stated that chocolate covered sort of insult. Those are those microaggressions, right? Those are those subtle things that we heard about a lot in the commentary of this report, but oftentimes that leads women to have self-doubt, to kind of overthink the way that they show up in work settings, and to really oftentimes blame themselves for the things that are happening to them at work. And so, yeah, it was hard to read through, but I'm glad that women felt safe and were able to, communicate those things that are impacting them so we could dive deeper into this topic.
Yeah, and I know I have heard from so many people that they have read them in departments, in companies and groups. They've actually, with men and women, read the comments and talked about them. So I want to shift over real quick and spend just a minute on, we had a number of questions. Let me share the screen. We had a number of questions that were, it looks like there were 9 that we used a Likert scale of 7 points and asked some questions. I just want to highlight a couple of things. So think of 7 points, right? When you look at this. And so the first one, I have experienced bias, subtle or overt, conscious or unconscious, that I feel is due to my gender. And that's almost 6 points out of 7. So that's agree. Not quite strongly agree, but getting there, right? And so that's interesting. I hear sexist comments often. Now, this is an interesting one, because if you look over here, it has a big standard deviation. That means there was a big amount of difference between a lot of women and other women, but still a little bit more than neutral, which means that actually some women are hearing a lot, some women may not be. And I thought this third one was fascinating. Some people behave in sexist ways without realizing it. That's pretty high. I mean, 6.3 out of 7. A lot of people are just saying, I think a lot of people don't get that they're sexist. Don't you think that's what they're saying, Robbyn? Yeah, they're just not getting that. And the next one, women are more likely to hear sexist comments in Utah. Big standard deviation, which means there are a lot of people that said yes, and some people said no. Yeah. So any others on this list, Robbyn, especially you, because you were part of this, that you feel would be good to highlight?
I think the one that women need to be prepared to be leaders, right? And that's part of the whole reason why we're having this conversation, the vision and mission of the Utah Women in Leadership Project. We all know that all women in the state need to be leading in powerful ways. And if we are continuously fighting against the sexism that we're experiencing every day, how much harder is it for us to have an influence? How much harder is it for us to use our voices and stand up and lead? And so I love seeing that even though women recognize that there is a lot of sexism going on, and a lot of it not intentional. I think that number 3 is really powerful, that we know that a lot of people don't have bad intentions, but their sexism still harms us anyway, right? Yeah. So I think that was an important one out of this scale as well.
Yeah, I love that. The 8, I believe women can find meaningful opportunities to thrive in Utah. So people are hopeful. Not some people have kind of given up and moved, but there's some hope in that 5. And then last, is Utah making progress in terms of gender equity? And a little bit more than neutral. Again, some mixed there. And so just wanted to share that. But Robbyn, so there are 4 main themes, and I'm not going to share the screen too much longer, but I wanted to get people to look at this that came out of the research, including there was an overview and then 4 separate reports. Tell us a little bit more about the research analysis and how that took place.
So in the overview, a couple of things that I think it's important that everybody recognize that we gathered for these reports. First of all, we got demographic data and a lot of information about the women who took the survey. So when you go in and look at the briefs, you can understand the experiences that we were sharing. But we also took contextual data about where these comments were made. Was it a man or a woman making the sexist comment? What was the setting? What was the age of the person? And what was the relative level of authority? So when you go into the briefs, you can see we know a little bit more about the comments and how they happened. But getting into those 4 different major categories and themes, and these are broader and we'll go into it a little bit more deeply, but the inequity and bias in the first one, just a lot of comments just with this basic definition of sexism. Men are different than women. Women are different in inferior ways. And the bias really showed up in unconscious bias. We know that that's a big problem. All of us experience it. No one is free from unconscious bias, but so many of these sexist comments were not meant to be egregious, but they happened anyway. The next one, the objectification, in a nutshell, is seeing women not as whole living human beings, but as objects, whether they are sexual objects, maternal objects, whatever. That are the comments that came under that objectification. The third one, which was stereotypes, a lot of focus on female stereotypes related to motherhood, marriage, but other things about women not being good at changing a light bulb, like literal weird stereotypes that we see all throughout that third category. And then the fourth one was undervaluing women, which in every way seeing as women's contributions being somehow inherently less valuable than men's. And again, there are subcategories within all of these.
Thank you. And we'll dive into those, but to you 3 panelists, if you're seeing some applicable questions as we move forward, please bring those in anytime. Deneiva, we're going to start with that first one, inequity and bias. And I know you just reread these probably this morning or yesterday. What stuck out to you specifically that you think is important to highlight?
Yeah, I think what's important for me, like we know that women of marginalized communities often experience sexism at a greater level, typically in like more dire circumstances than non-women of color or non-protected groups. Although the research that we reviewed specific about Utah did not have any data on these groups alone, we know that national data kind of does implicate that women of marginalized communities have different lived experiences, right? We know that nearly like half of LGBTQ women feel like they have to tone down their presence in order to avoid being unlikable in a work setting. Women with disabilities are afraid to speak up oftentimes because they don't want to feel like they come across as being difficult or easy to do business with. And then we know that a third of Black women, there are 3 times the number of white women. So a third of Black women said that they have to either code switch, adjust their language, their behavior, their appearances to fit into the dominant culture at work. And oftentimes this is they risk being alienated or discriminated against at work if they aren't able to code switch in a way to kind of fit in with the majority population there, which can stunt career growth opportunities. We spoke about microaggressions a little bit earlier, and we know that microaggressions make it harder for women to take risk, to throw out new ideals during meetings, to raise concerns about things that might be happening in the workplace. And we have to ask, what does that do for the workplace itself? How does that limit innovation? How does that limit brainstorming opportunities and that sort of things if you have a large number of your workforce that is afraid to take risk or afraid to introduce new ideals? And so I think it's a benefit for everybody to figure out a way to overcome these. Oftentimes women find themselves, and I can say this for myself as well, we find ourselves where we're like self-shielding in order to combat or in order to navigate through some of these complexities at the workplace. And oftentimes when women do that, they're more likely to feel burnout at work. They're more likely to quit their positions at work because someone said this early on, it's not like you're just like hiking up that mountain, right? When you are hiking up that mountain with a sack full of microaggressions or you're carrying a boulder, it's like you have to do your job and you have to look out for all of these other things that we have to look out to as being women in the workplace. And so I think the findings in the report were very enlightening. And we do have to think about the different types of lived experience for different women in the workplace.
Yes, and I know that, Robbyn, we did, I don't know if it was in this report or another one, I can't remember, but we did have a short, not enough, but a short section on intersectional, and a bit about race. And did disabilities come in there too?
Yes, there are numerous other identities, individual identities that are shared among us. So we had intersectionality that dealt with weight, with being heavy, with LGBTQ status, with race, with age was another factor that came in, disabilities. So we definitely noticed the layers of discrimination that many women experience.
Thank you. And before I go to you, Heather, let me put this screen up here that so people can look at the reports or look at the topics that are sectioned off into this first report. Again, we have an overview, and then this is the second report, but you can see in this report, the title here, but also how many, we've got particular, like how many comments were specifically on each one. So these are so look at that total percentage and the number. So there were a lot of people that mentioned this in the first report. So Heather, for you, which of the themes, now I just showed those very quickly, but which of the themes within this report actually surprised you? Did any of them surprise you or shock you in this particular report?
It's always tricky when people attribute saying to someone else, well, I don't think they meant to do this. And so that one was the largest one, where it was sort of like, oh, people sort of unconsciously made these remarks. And I think that's a very female thing to do. I think it's very female for us to kind of gift someone the benefit of the doubt, and that's fine. But the flip side of that is that then we are somehow owning it and we're carrying it and we're taking the responsibility for it. I love what Deneiva was talking about the implications of this, the implications of these microaggressions. There is so much psychological pain that comes from dealing with this type of stuff? I mean, I was thinking of 3 different ways. I was thinking like, okay, a lot of women think it's my fault, because we always think it's our fault. If you're sexually harassed, or, you know, if you're assaulted, what was I wearing? Where was I? Did I somehow do something stupid or say something I shouldn't have said? Was I too strong? Was I too weak? Did I come across as too smart or too dumb? Do I spend too much time on my appearance or not enough? If there's some kind of incident, we immediately try to figure out what we did. What did we do wrong that somehow could have prevented it? And then another thing we do to ourselves is we then beat ourselves up. Like, why didn't I do something? Yeah. It's like, it's our fault. And then I didn't do anything. So it's like, we just experienced this psychological pain. We feel hurt. We feel denigrated. And then we blame ourselves. It's like, wait, I've got this. You don't have to be any meaner to me. I'll take it from here.
And we do that sometimes. Robbyn, I'm coming over to you, but I am going to read a couple of quotes from our report. On one, my manager said, your peer will be representing the study you do because it will look better coming from a man. So I'm just saying, think about that. If that what happened over and over again, that's more than a microaggression. That is impacting a career, right? Here's another one. When the individual realized I was the manager, they asked for the actual man who was in charge. This one irritates me because I was a coach for so many years. She said, this one was from a woman. Girls just aren't good at sports. They are slower and suck to watch. I'm like, what is that? And this one turns my stomach. He said, if women weren't seducing men in the workplace, then these Me Too situations wouldn't be happening. Let me just do 2 more. A church leader told me to temper my career ambitions because my primary focus was to raise a family. And then we had, Robbyn, I'll tag over to you, but we had a lot on pay, hiring, but pay. So that gender gap, and I continue to get pushback in this state that there's not really a gender pay gap because women choose. And I'm like, we have hundreds of women's stories. They didn't choose this. So there were others as well, but I'll tag over to you, Robbyn. Anything else you would like to add on this?
Well, and I just want to say for the record that Claudia Golden just won the Nobel Prize for her work in economics, for her work in the gender pay gap. Like, if it's getting the Nobel Prize, people, this is real, right? This is happening. The gender pay gap is real. So we saw so many comments in this area. And again, they were working with this inequity and unconscious bias. One of the major unconscious biases that we saw was that women's income is supplemental, that women are working to kind of help the family go on trips or to, get a new couch or something like that, and not as an essential part of supporting their family. So we saw so many comments where a manager would say, you and your male counterpart were both up for this promotion. You are actually more accomplished than he is. You are a more effective worker, but we're giving it to him because he has a family to support, right? And we saw that over and over again, even for women who were single mothers and supporting their families all by themselves, even for women who were the primary wage earners in their home, right? So this unconscious bias and unequal way of treating women hurts them so deeply. And Susan, when you were talking about some of the more obvious comments, like when you're in that meeting, we're going to let a man say this. Those are very obvious, straightforward, and meant to distinguish. But we had a lot of comments, again, with the unconscious bias, where a woman who was working at a law firm, every time someone would walk in, they would think she was a receptionist, even though she was one of the partners in the law firm. And even though that person made what they could say, oh, an honest mistake, I just wasn't thinking. Over time, those add up, and you start thinking, am I really as effective as my male counterparts? Do people take me seriously as a lawyer? And so whether these are meant intentionally or unintentionally, the pain and harm that they cause is still real.
Thank you so much. One more quote from this report. There's many, many quotes, and I think they're really helpful for us to learn and grow, and for men as well. But there was one, I learned that in private, men were caught discussing our salaries and laughing at how much lower they were. And so we could go on that, but do any of you three see any comments in the chat or any questions that we want to pull out or address before we shift over to number 2? Anything?
I just want to add a comment that one of my clients told me this week, and I have permission to share it. This woman's father-in-law, who has 1 son and 4 daughters, he says to all of them regularly that higher education steals women's souls. So for me, that's my sexist comment of the week.
Okay. We should start something on LinkedIn for sexist comments of the week. Oh my gosh. Robbyn, over to you.
Well, Kendra made a comment here in the chat. My manager has said things to me like, women don't aspire to be in leadership as much as men, and complained that there's no such thing as men-only support groups when I ask permission to go to a Women Tech Council networking event. So we see a couple things here, right? There is the defensiveness and backlash against feminism. Like, well, there's no Men Tech Council event today, even though I always argue every event is Men Tech Council event day, right? But at the same time, another layer here, women don't aspire to be in leadership. If that, in the first place, it's not true. But in the second place, for individual women who don't aspire to be in leadership, why is that? Is it because they don't have time? Because they are carrying all the unpaid burdens of a family life at home? Is it because they've been taught that they cannot be leaders and would be ineffective leaders? Like, even a sentence like that isn't true, at any level that it is true, there is a whole mountain underneath it of reasons why. Women naturally, we come into the world ready to be leaders, ready to lead just as much as anyone else. And if we don't aspire to be leaders, it's because the world has put a ton, like Deneiva was talking about, that boulder that we're carrying up the mountain while we're also trying to do our jobs. I think that's a really fascinating comment there.
Yeah. Deneiva, anything you're seeing before we switch to the next?
Yeah, I think I'll just chime in. There's a couple of comments in the chat about, how do you approach your leadership with this? How do you approach your boss? How do you navigate through this at work? I don't think there's an easy fix in a way to do that. I think one, it requires courage, right? Because every time that you're advocating for yourself or you're being an ally to another woman in the workplace, you're sort of putting the spotlight on yourself, and you have to be prepared for that. And I think organizations and companies can respond in different ways. Sometimes companies might automatically have the defense mechanism, don't want to agree or acknowledge that this type of stuff is taking place for different reasons, liability, lawsuits, and that sort of thing. But by being so dismissive and not taking people's accounts or lived experiences seriously, you really are just putting a Band-Aid over it or dismissing it in general, and you're not solving the real problem to make sure that all of your employees feel valued, feeling that they contribute and be successful. And so I think to the women in the chat who are looking for resources, I would say to try to identify those folks within your company where you can have candid conversations with to get coaching and professional development. And then also try to find a network outside of your company where you feel like it's a safe place where you can kind of talk through these nuanced situations to get advice that way.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Let's shift to the third of 5 reports. And this is the one I think I had more tears on this one. And I remember reading it, the final on a Saturday morning, and I made my husband come in and I started reading all of them to him. And he's like, oh my gosh. And a couple of them, he's like, I don't see the issues as much because they were more subtle. And until you start addressing those and learning, you might not see them. But before I put up the screen real quick, I'm just going to read a couple, okay, to get us started. And this one's objectification. So here are a couple. My bishop said over the pulpit that his pretty wife was a reward for him being a good missionary. So the young men in the ward need to be good missionaries. So another one is, he said, if you dress in clothes that are tight, you are inhibiting the ability of our men to do their jobs. You are a distraction. There's many other ones. Those are the ones that popped out for me. But I'll share probably a couple more later. But let me put up the slides so you can see a bit of what was happening here. So if you can see here, that objectification here, focus on physical appearance was one of the sections, sexual harassment, sexualizing women, unwanted sexual advancements, the intersectional discrimination, being excluded from work activities, and accusations of sex to get ahead. So those are the ones, and again, you can read this in the report. But let's go back to, let me go in a different order. Deneiva, let's jump over to you and have you go first on this one. Anything surprise you? Anything that was validating? I saw a note in the chat. I don't know, I can't remember what it said now, but it said, I don't know whether to feel angry or validated. I don't know which one to feel. So any thoughts to start us off on this next one, Deneiva?
Yeah, and I don't think you have to choose, right? You could feel a little bit of both. But I think the thing that stuck out as me is being judged either on appearances. And for women specifically, I think appearances are one thing, but we're also judged on every word that we say, the tone of the words, the inflection of the words. Whereas we can have a male counterpart come in that same room or come into that same meeting, use the same words, the same tone, and the same everything, and they're perceived a different way. And so talking about the wage gap, one thing that sometimes we don't talk about is how women oftentimes receive a lack of support from their leaders and their managers compared to their male counterparts. And you talk about marginalized groups, that gap is even wider for the amount of support that oftentimes women receive in the workplace. And how does that contribute to the wage gap? Well, if you're excluded from activities that give you access to leaders or give you access to networking, oftentimes too, male leaders have this thing where it's called hesitation bias with feedback. And so they're either scared to give candid feedback because they're afraid of being viewed as racist or sexist or a lot of these things, or they give very vague feedback, like you're unreliable, without giving a specific example of where maybe you missed a deadline and how can you improve or improve on your behaviors or your performance so that you get a better rating later. And so all of this inability to receive feedback hinders a woman's ability to focus on their professional development and growth and be ready available to take on job offers that may have a higher income level. So I think that contributes to the wage gap, and we should really take a look at that. Like, how can we support women, mentor women so they're getting the professional development that they need, and then also train their male leaders to be able to be comfortable to give this candid feedback that oftentimes women need in order to be successful in their careers.
So much research around what you were just saying, Deneiva. So I appreciate that. Women do get significantly less feedback, and the research on leadership development is that feedback is so important, and specific feedback. Heather, let's have you jump in. Anything specific that comes to mind? Well, I should say, I said anything. Everything comes to mind, I'm sure,
Yes.
but what are the things that come to mind at the top?
So what comes to mind with a lot of this that's so body related, that's so focused on women's appearances and bodies, is that many of us in our lives have been physically harmed by people. Many of us have experienced not just sexism, and not just verbal assault, but physical assault as well. And so for a lot of us, when you hear these kind of comments, you really go into that fight, flight, freeze, fawn mode where you are just like, oh my gosh, like what's coming next? Are they going to touch me? Like, how can I get out of here? Like it. And so sometimes, again, like I was saying before, one of the terrible effects of this is that we're so hard on ourselves, is that we're being assaulted. We somehow think it's our fault. And then we're like, why didn't I do anything? It's not your fault that you didn't do anything. You froze. You are like, I don't want to get hurt. And so the best thing I can do is for most of us, we go to the freeze or fawn, where we either do nothing or someone makes a sexist comment at our expense. And sometimes you even find yourself laughing. And later on, you're like, why did I do that? It's because that person had the power and the privilege, and you felt threatened, and you thought that the easiest way to make it go away was to go along with it.
Yeah.
And we can't beat ourselves up for that, because that is like a biological response.
Yeah. And it was amazing when we analyzed responses, that so many of the responses, and we'll get more into that later, but Robbyn, you can touch on this too, but so many were, they just walked off, they didn't know what to do, they kind of shut down, laughed it off, they just, or were in shock. I remember one woman just outright never showed up for work again. Do you remember that one? She just didn't know what to do and felt threatened and just was humiliated and just never quit, just didn't show up again. Throwing it over to you, Robbyn.
I will say, I love having a therapist on the call with us so Heather can explain like why we do the things. I mean, it actually is super important to understand, well, was I just a chicken? Was I just whatever? And no, there's a psychological, physiological, biological reason why it is really difficult to respond in the moment. So Heather, thank you so much for those ideas. Susan, you mentioned this at the beginning, but I just wanted to emphasize, this was the section, the objectification, where we saw the most horrific examples, that we chose not to include many of them in the brief because they were extremely graphic, right? So graphic examples of sexual assault. We didn't ask for that. We asked for sexist comments, and women said, I was raped after work one day in the, whatever. And so we saw very, very distressing, very disturbing examples of horrible behavior targeted towards women.
Just real quick here to back to Heather and your comment, what we know in the state of Utah, and data are hard to kind of collect and so forth, but the estimate is 1 in 3 women will experience sexual assault, and 1 in 6 have been or will be raped, and 79% below the age of 18. So when we think that it's only certain people that have experienced, every time I look in my classroom or my audience, I think of 1 in 6 or 1 in 3. Back to you, Robbyn.
Well, thank you so much. And that really brings the importance of these types of conversations to the forefront. And so one of the things that we saw throughout this area, especially, is a focus on women's bodies, the sexualization of women's bodies, was a lot of jokes, right? We saw a lot of jokes that, again, people are trying to be funny. People are trying to improve their own status among the other men on their team. But we had a woman who was giving a keynote speech in front of a large audience. This one is so gross.
You remember this one?
Yeah, she had to bend down to fix something under her podium, like her cord had come unplugged, and there was a man down there standing next to her, and he said, well, while you're down there, just making this implication. So, and then she had to stand up and give a keynote speech at a conference, right? Can you imagine that situation? So again, someone in the moment, not thinking, trying to be funny, and people could say, oh, he was just making a joke, laugh it off. Well, imagine, I mean, that situation is horrible, but also imagine if that was one of those 1 in 3 or 1 in 6 who had experienced sexual violence. How does she go on to give a speech after that, right? And so a lot of really interesting comments like that. Another area that came up that's related to what I was talking about the last section was women being left out of workplace experiences. And someone has mentioned this in the chat, like the informal networking of on the golf course and things like that. We saw a number of comments where women were very specifically and deliberately left out of workforce experiences, not because they weren't qualified to be there or whatever, but because they were not seen as a colleague, they were not seen as a peer, they were seen as a sexual object. So we had comments such as a man telling a woman on his team, my wife has to meet every woman that I work with to make sure that she's not a threat, right? So she's not a colleague, she's a sexual object. Other comments like that, I would never drive in a car with a woman to go to a meeting, but my boss drives with his male subordinates all the time, things like that. And again, it makes women, they feel a little bit gaslighted, like, am I really trying to seduce men in the workplace? Am I trying to do these other things, right? We get this pushback, but at the same time, women second guess themselves, it hits their confidence, but it legitimately and demonstratively hurts their careers. It puts them behind. And it's one of the reasons why women are not able to achieve the level of success that they should be achieving, because they're dealing with this kind of garbage all the time. Not all the time, just a lot of the time.
Yeah, and some don't see as much. What's interesting though is I've had many women who said, I never thought any of this was happening until they had something so egregious happen to them. And then they started paying attention and really changed and shifted. I do want to say that there is quite a bit of research out there in terms of religious cultures and more conservative cultures. And that in religious, at least according to some of the research, in religious and conservative cultures, sexual objectification is higher. And so, and then we struggle as women more if it's higher with, with body image issues, with all of those kinds of things. So I just think that's something to keep in the back of our minds. Oh my gosh, we could spend the whole time just on one of these, but we're going to move forward after Robbyn's finger is up. So I will call on Robbyn.
Just really quickly, Carrie asked a question here in the chat. Susan's comment about the bishop hints at what many women perceive as the underlying problem in Utah culture with patriarchy and how it reinforces sexism. Please discuss this and whether there were research findings that address this. Carrie, yes, we did see this in the research. And Susan just mentioned a completely different study, right, related to traditional religious cultures. But that did come up as a strong theme within this, is that comments made in church and religious settings, partly because of the patriarchal structure, partly because of the very strict, rigid roles between men and women. So it was absolutely something that came up, and you can learn more about that in the briefs.
Great, thank you so much. Let's shift now to the fourth, which is the third area. Again, we did an overview and then 4 other. And so the next one is stereotypes. Let me just read a few of the ones that I felt were ones that that actually represented many of the things that I've heard women say. He told me I was pretty good at math for a girl. A friend from high school maintains that women cannot be leaders because they were not designed that way. Another one said, I can't believe you don't make lunch for your husband every day. There was another one, and now I can't remember what it was. But Robbyn, I'm going to go backwards. I'm going to have you start instead of end on this one and share some of your, I haven't shared my screen. Let me do that first so people can glance. So here we go over here. And this one's stereotypes. So gender, your general, but a lot of comments in terms of women should prioritize homemaking. And then that internal sexism that Robbyn had mentioned before, the motherhood penalty, benevolent sexism, and then that double bind. So Robbyn, start us off on this one.
So I want to draw attention to the women should prioritize homemaker roles. And a really strong theme we saw in here was related to what we call the mommy wars, which is in itself an infantilizing term about women, a sexist term, but it's very common how women who are home full-time will look down on women who are working and vice versa. And in this study, because so many of our comments came from professional women who were working, we heard many, many more comments saying, you don't really love your children because you go to work. How can you allow someone else to raise your children? Things like that. We see those types of comments a lot, but we know that those comments are very, very common, going both ways. And it comes back to this idea that I mentioned earlier in the chat, that in our culture, because women are the subordinate class of our culture, they are taught to compete, they are taught to judge each other, they are taught to criticize each other. And so one of the themes that came forward very strong in this brief was this idea that women are doing it, whatever, if they are already feeling insecure about their choices, maybe they have to push back against other women to justify the behavior that we're doing. But just a couple of really egregious examples. From this section, we had a woman who said that she was going on a humanitarian trip to Haiti. Yeah. And another woman said, oh, I would love to go overseas and do something like that, but I just love my children too much to leave them home, right? Like going on a 2-week trip or a 1-week trip means somehow you don't love your children. I mentioned the comment before that you are letting someone else raise your children. Every time you go to work, you're abandoning your child, right? So we heard a lot of comments like that, which we all know are garbage, right? Mm-hmm. But women at home can also hear those same types of comments, like, well, I can't do that thing, because I have an important job to do, right? And so this idea that we're putting women against each other because of their roles is really problematic, and it's something that we saw come through really strongly in this. And I just want to share my own brand of feminism, is that every woman gets to do whatever she wants to do, right? I think that it is so harmful in society that we have ideas about what a successful, what a great, what a wonderful woman should be like. In my opinion, every woman is wonderful if she's doing what she needs to be doing and wants to be doing. And we need to see more of that.
We need to respect women's decisions. We need to make sure women and girls know that they have decisions and then respect that. I just have to share real quick. When I was living in Minnesota and I was in my doctoral program, this was a long time ago, in my church group, I had a woman twice say to me, I can't believe that you leave your children to go do your education. And I only left him a couple evenings a week and my husband was there. But she said it twice. She said, I just can't imagine why you think you have to do this. And I will tell you that my response that second time, and I've used it since, and I get teary-eyed thinking about it, I just leaned right into her and had my finger up and I said, she said it that second time, why are you leaving your children? And I said, because God told me to. I am in school because God told me to. And that pretty much ended that conversation. So I can't remember what order we're in with the other two. Who's been last? Heather, you've been second lots of times. So let me go to Deneiva and you can finish us off, Heather, this time. Deneiva, let's go over to you.
Yeah, I think one of the things that sticks out for me, and it's also in a relation to what Robbyn spoke about the women who decide to stay at home to be stay-at-home mothers and women in the workplace. I think it behooves us all to get to know the women that we work with, to get to know the women that we lead. Oftentimes it's not a choice. You're privileged to have a choice to be able to stay at home and take care of your kids and not go to work in some cases. We have so many single mothers out there. We have women that are running away from abusive relationships and whatnot, who often don't have the choice. They have to be the breadwinners of their family. And so just to say to a woman like, well, you should be at home taking care of your families, is something that we really, really need to be mindful of when we go into these situations, and how as women can we support each other. Any decision that we decide to make for our families, or any kind of situation we find ourselves in, how can we be more supportive of each other as well, as our male counterparts being supportive in that space.
And these comments, I really appreciate that. And it's just a reminder that these comments were not just workplace too, but some of them crossed over into church or man, did we get a lot, Robbyn? Do you remember? I mean, we got so many from women who were working in politics or running for office. Some of those were the hardest ones to hear in that. Heather.
Yeah. So Susan, I love that you had to invoke God to, silence that woman like that. That's kind of nuts. That's sort of nuts that it took that. So I want to offer people a couple, because if you're like me, somebody says something and you're like the deer in the headlights, you're just kind of stuck. And then later that night, you're like, I should have said, and you come up with all these. I think there's a whole Seinfeld episode about, coming up with the good reply after. So I have a couple different replies I want to share with people depending on your level of comfort with assertiveness. So the first one's more assertive. The second one is a little more, I don't know, Relief Society voice, whatever you want to call it. So the first one, if someone says something sexist to you, either benevolent or outright obnoxious, male, female, one thing you can say is, are you aware of how that comes across? I'm interested to know if that was your intention. So just like asking people, and they're like, well, I just meant that your handwriting's better than mine, and that's why you should take notes. And because then you can just be like, oh, because it kind of sounds like you're saying, because I'm a girl, that I should take notes. And that's just wondering if that's what you think, like, and then some people, if they don't realize what they're doing, then they'll realize they're embarrassed. And if they're a jerk, then force them to own it. Force them to just come out. And so then a slightly softer version of that is, can you repeat that? I'm not sure I understood what you meant.
Oh.
So that one, and for me, it is helpful to memorize these phrases so that when it happens, you don't have to stop and think. You can kind of have this thing in your back pocket that you pull out, can you repeat that? I'm not sure I got what you meant. If they tell some joke or something inappropriate, forcing people to kind of dig into it. It doesn't fix everything, but it makes you feel more powerful. And it also lets the people around you know that sometimes people will then join in. Yeah, what did you mean by that? Why did you, that sounded kind of bad? Because ideally we should be allies in this as men and women. And if somebody is, being sexist, the people around, everyone should join in. And so this just gives you a little more, if you have a script, it's just easier.
Yeah, and Robbyn, I was going to ask you, because you had a couple of other responses that you had shared that work good, just to get, sometimes we just need a moment to think.
Yeah. I mean, one of the ones that a lot of people recommend is just saying, ouch, just sitting in the moment, or like, whoa, just some sort of outburst there to kind of give yourself a pause and bring it up in the room to say, what just happened wasn't an okay thing to happen, right? And that might even give somebody else the courage to step in a minute if you're still processing. But I think Heather's recommendations were great as well. What did you mean by that? I have heard a woman who said, let me tell you how that landed. And so sharing a little bit of empathy in that moment and maybe giving grace to the person who said it. I'm guessing that you didn't mean to say this offensive thing, but let me tell you how it landed for me, I think is another powerful comeback there.
And I love one of the politicians. I did a group for about a couple of years ago for about 50 women politicians. And one, I remember, just said, this happened to me last week, but I knew this man would not intentionally do that. So she said, I pulled him aside and said, I know your heart is in the right place, and I know you wouldn't want to, but this is what you said, and this is how it came across. And I just want to make sure you know that, because I know you wouldn't want to treat people intentionally poorly. So that education piece, I think, figuring out how to do that more. But what I appreciated about Heather's comment is the way that you gave those comments they weren't emotional. They were just like, let me inquire and see what's happening there. Okay, we need to get to our last one. And Deneiva, let me have you start on this one. And this one is about, let me share my screen, undervaluing women. So you can see undervaluing women's contributions here. Condescending, you shared a little bit about that. Assumed incompetence, just assumed. And can I just say, and then affirmative action. So can I just say that 2 weeks ago, I had a blowout of a tire on the side of the freeway. And it was in the dark, all this stuff happened. Finally, a 75-year-old man pulled up an incident management. I was like very happy to see that. But he assumed incompetence, and guess what? I have to tell you, I was heading up to Logan, and I'm like, I said to my, I didn't make it to teach. My graduate assistant taught, but I texted her, I do not feel like an empowered woman right now. Had to just share that, but I need to remind myself after 40 years how to change a tire. But anyway, sorry to get us off track here. But Deneiva, let's have you start.
Yeah. And so I think all of those data points or bullet points you pulled up, I could personally probably speak to all of them, unfortunately. I think the assumed incompetence, I think there's like an ageism thing because I look a little bit on the younger side than I am. Oftentimes, being the only woman in the room and then being the only woman of the room, you always have to go into spaces and know that you have to prove yourself first. People aren't automatically going to listen to what you have to say or take you, for your word. For example, you're going to have to prove that with some sweat equity sometimes. And I think as women, that's just something that we have to carry with us, right? And all the spaces that, typically all the spaces that we're in. I think post 2020, I've also dealt with, and colleagues and friends as well in the community have dealt with that last one, the affirmative action sort of bullet point, or the DE&I, where it's presumed you're in this position because you are a woman, because you are a woman of color or whatever. And having to prove that that is not the case, like I'm in this room because I deserve to be here. Here are my experiences. Here are the values that I can contribute when I'm allowed to contribute. This is kind of what I could bring to the team, to the organization, and an external.
But you have to feel like you have to justify, doesn't that? I mean, I don't like it when I have to do that, but you have the three intersectional things that you talked about: age, gender, and race. But does that bug the heck out of you sometimes?
I think, in my 40s, I've just kind of gotten used to it, and it's become business as usual, that I just know, when I come into some spaces, that's the way it is. I remember when I first moved to Utah, for example, being introduced in community meetings and walking in and have people not even look you in your eye, like you're dismissed, like we already know you're not going to add value in this situation. So why do we even have to address you or look at you? And then oftentimes when you open your mouth, when it's your time to speak at the table, their sort of mouths drop because there's so many stereotypes that are associated with someone that looks like me, and maybe I don't fit some of the circumstances. So they're like, wow, you can speak a sentence. You can do X, Y, and Z. Yeah. And I'm sure many of you have experienced that too, right? In your role showing up as a woman in certain situations. But unfortunately, I think it's become business as usual. And we do have to empower ourselves a little bit and build our toolbox so we can show up in a confident way and be able to prove ourselves in these situations, get beyond that, and then get to the work, right? Because we all want to add value. We want to get to the work. I think that's our main goal. We're just trying to contribute, not take away from situations.
Thank you. I'm looking at the time, and we've got a few more minutes, but we're moving along. And Heather, any comment on that one from you?
So I love the comment that Deneiva made in the comments, where she said that sometimes you have to be careful about what you do, like being careful about, don't offer to take notes, and that is such a hard thing, because as women, we are socialized to be helpful, like
or to organize lunches all the time, all of those things.
Yes. And I think that it's okay sometimes to give ourselves permission that we don't have to do that's okay. That's okay. I don't have to actually bake cupcakes because it's this person's birthday. Like that's all right. And sometimes and someone else said that she felt in the comments, said that she feels like she always has to overcompensate, and that, she's hard on herself because of it. But then she's like, but do I do it because I have more to prove? Because there is this sort of assumed incompetence. And I, as a therapist, I would say, do what you have to do in the workplace, in the community, to get what you need to do done. But you've got to have some self-care. You have to have some time, some spaces where you can just vent and complain to people about the sucky things that happen. It's okay to complain. If you go running and you sweat, that sweat cools you off. It helps you sort of process. Venting is the same thing. When you are emotionally running, venting allows you to kind of cool yourself off. And it's okay. It's okay to be frustrated, find like-minded people, do self-care, do things that allow you to kind of
don't cross
get
over
back
too
in.
Much. Yeah, don't cross over too much into rumination. Just kind of get it there, and then Because we as
Because
women can
if you
ruminate.
keep it in your head, that's when you're going to get on the hamster
That's
wheel.
true.
But if you're talking to someone else, they're going to say, oh my gosh, that sucked. They're going to validate you. And when you're validated, it's so much easier to let something go.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And real quick, I did see a comment a while back that I don't know if we've addressed, and that is, and I was just doing a radio show with Amanda Dixon this morning on microaggressions. And so I was thinking about this, but there are men who are stay-at-home fathers. I almost said stay-at-home moms, that are stay-at-home fathers, right? And sexism can go the other way, of course. In some ways, we know that much of it goes towards women, but stay-at-home fathers probably get lots of sexist comments towards them too. Back to you, Robbyn, to finish us off. Any comments, examples on this last one, again, of undervaluing women?
A couple of things I want to mention. There are really the chats go in strong, and it's not visible to everyone, Susan, but just going along with what Heather just said about being heard and validated, I'm hoping there's a way that we could share some of these comments from the chat.
Yeah, we can.
So maybe that can be part of the recording as well. But we're reading them and they're very interesting. So thanks everybody for sharing your experiences. One aspect of this specific brief that I found really interesting was the condescending and infantilizing. And I don't know that we've really hit on that too much yet, but there were a number of comments that went back to an era when women were literally the property of men. So there were comments like, oh, I can't believe your husband lets you have such a demanding job. Or something like, you better call your husband and ask him if it's okay for you to apply for this promotion. Or literally like a boss calling a man and saying, your daughter's doing such a good job at work. And then she made the note, like, I was 25 at the time, right? Like she was an adult woman just doing her job. But this man like felt like he had the right to say, oh, your daughter is still your property. Your wife is still your property. And so we're going to treat her as such. And that is something that we saw come through in the data, which are really, really, again, distressing and frustrating situations. So again, there are so many interesting and infuriating and frustrating comments that we can read in all of these briefs. And there have been some comments in the chat here, like, how can we share this information? How can we convince people that this is real? This research is powerful and it tells a very powerful story. It's hard to dismiss 1,750 specific comments that women were brave enough and willing to share with us through this research study. So that's kind of the last thing I have to say.
Thank you so much. We need to conclude, but I want to give each of you like 30 seconds to just say, and oh, before I do that, these briefs, if you read them, they're about 5-6 pages, but there are more responses, more information on responses. So there are tools right in there. One of my dreams, do you remember this, Robbyn? I had just remembered. My dream was to do an app. Like, nobody take it. This is like, I need to get credit for this. To do an app, to, you know, put together an app where people can say in a meeting, this just happened to me, and then have good responses come over so they can, here's a response if you want to be rude. Here's a response if you want. But I was just amazed at how many people either just walked away or just were emotional and wanted that, or but how many people were starting to learn, and we had some good ideas from people that we did share in the briefs. So now to each of you, just 30 seconds as we conclude. What are a few final thoughts as you've looked at, as we've talked, as you've looked at comments? What haven't we touched on, or any final thoughts? Let's start with Heather on this one.
As women, we've just established that we understand this, that a lot of men don't see it. And, you know, that's frustrating. And I would say, I'm not trying to be silver linings here, but I would say, take that additional lens that we have as women and try to apply it to people with different social locations. Try to look out for people, you know, who may be on the autism spectrum, or people with disabilities, or people with different ethnic or racial backgrounds, and try to see what's impacting them, because, you know, we all know what impacts us. But in some ways, the beauty of being part of a group that is disadvantaged is that then you have that lens and you know what it's like, and you can take that empathy and hopefully take some time and learn what are the microaggressions that these other people experience that you maybe are unknowingly contributing to. And so take it and turn it a little bit inward.
I love that. Deneiva.
Yeah, and similar to that, I think like self-reflection is key. I think reading through a lot of the commentary and the commonalities in a lot of those with a lot of the responses is just something that I want to do from reading. And I want to encourage a lot of folks on the call to do is how might you be an ally for the women that you interact with or the women in your circle. And you don't have to stand up in a really visible way, but there are things that you could do to support women that are who are the closest to you in a workplace setting. And so how might you do that a little bit more? I think the more support that we can lend on each other, I think the easier it'll be for all of us.
Thank you. And Robbyn.
Deneiva, I love what you said so much about that self-reflection. And I think that's really powerful. One of my main takeaways from this was that I was saying sexist stuff all the time and didn't realize it, right? Like we are the recipients of this so often, but sometimes we are the perpetrators of it. And sometimes we are doing harmful things as well. And so I love that idea for us to be self-reflection and making sure that we're doing our best and then giving space for other people and try to help them understand how they can be doing better as well. So grateful for the opportunity to have this conversation. Loved so many of the comments in the chat. Everybody, thank you so much for participating. It was really, really fun to be here with you today.
And thank you to all three of you. What a joy it's been to talk about this, even though these are hard topics, to be able to have this conversation and help the listeners and hopefully hundreds and thousands of others who would watch this or read those reports really understand more deeply what it is. And then we're hoping that we can change, even us. How do we respond? How do we make sure we're not being sexist to other women? How can we teach and educate men and women and our children? Don't you think this can be really important for our children as well? So thank you to all. Thank you again to our sponsors, the Utah Education Network, the John M. Huntsman School of Business, and USU Extension for making this event possible. Have a wonderful day to all of you.